The prairie wind carried no voice, only the whistle of dust and the creak of the windmill that hadn't seen oil in a year. Elias Boone sat on the porch of his ranch house, hat low, pipe cold, staring at the nothing that stretched forever. He'd lived alone so long that even the coyotes had stopped calling near his place. The only sound left was the whisper of fence wire and his own breath. Inside, a single piece of paper sat on the table, worn at the folds, edges curled like a memory that refused to stay young. He'd written it 2 months ago, a letter to a woman he'd never met. A mail-order bride, the agency called it. Respectable ladies looking for homes out west. Elias wasn't sure what kind of woman answered those letters, but loneliness had a way of making a man stop asking questions. He wasn't looking for beauty. He wasn't looking for adventure. He just wanted someone to share the silence with. The arrival. By late spring, the reply came. A photograph, faded but kind. A woman from Kansas, named Mary in Caldwell. The agency said she was ready to travel, ready to start a new life. So Elias prepared. He cleaned the porch, fixed the rail, even bought new china plates from town, the first he'd ever owned. The neighbors teased him. Old Boone's settling down, huh? Gonna have a missus to nag him now. He just smiled and tipped his hat. He didn't tell them he'd been eating alone for 10 years. On a dry morning that smelled of dust and sagebrush, the stagecoach came thundering down the road. Elias stood by the post, heart thumping like a green boy waiting for his first dance. The coach stopped. The door opened, and instead of Mary, Ann from Kansas, a small woman stepped down. Black hair tied neatly, eyes like polished river stones. She wore a plain gray dress and carried a small wooden box, held close as if it contained her whole world. The driver tossed a bag to the ground and said, "Name's Lee May. Says she's your bride, Mr. Boone. Best I can tell, she don't speak a lick of English." Elias blinked, confused. "Where's Mary in Caldwell?" The driver shrugged. "She fell ill in St. Louis. This one volunteered. Said she'd come in her place. Wanted a safe place to live, some work to do. Agency approved it." Then, just like that, the coach rattled off, leaving a cloud of dust and a silence thick enough to cut. 2 strangers on one porch. Elias stood frozen. The woman bowed slightly, uncertain. "Lee, May," she said softly, pressing her hand to her chest. He took off his hat awkwardly. "Elias Boone," he replied. She nodded, though the words meant nothing. He tried again, slower. "Home," he said, pointing toward the house. She tilted her head. Then, with a small smile, she pointed to her chest again. "Lee May." He sighed, not angry, just lost. Inside the house, she moved carefully, eyes scanning everything. The cracked walls, the wooden stove, the framed photograph of his late parents. She placed her small wooden box on the table and opened it gently. Inside were only 2 things, a silk ribbon and a small porcelain figure, a dancing woman with her arms outstretched. Elias watched silently. She caught him staring and smiled, embarrassed, then quickly shut the box. That night, the 2 of them sat at the table, the lamplight flickering weakly. Elias served beans and cornbread. She didn't seem to know what to do with the fork, so she used her fingers, dainty and careful. Neither spoke, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. Outside, the wind moaned against the shutters. Inside, 2 lonely hearts listened to the sound and tried to make sense of the silence between them. The quiet night. After supper, she gathered the dishes without being asked, washed them neatly. Then she stood by the door, looking out at the endless dark. Elias brought her a blanket, motioning to the spare room. She nodded, whispered, "Thank you." The accent twisted the words, but the meaning came through clean. He lingered a moment outside her door, hearing her hum softly, a tune he'd never heard before, gentle and foreign, like a lullaby from another world. Back in his room, he sat at the edge of his bed, picked up his journal, and wrote. "She don't speak my tongue, but she moves with grace. I don't know if she's afraid of me or not. Maybe we're both afraid of the same thing, the quiet." He closed the book and listened. The wind had died. Only her soft humming filled the night, steady as the heartbeat of the earth. Days of silence. Morning came with pale light through thin curtains. Lee May was already awake, sweeping the porch, her hair tied in a simple braid. When Elias stepped outside, coffee in hand, she smiled, a shy, uncertain smile that reached her eyes. He pointed to the coffee pot, then to her. Coffee. She shook her head, smiled again. No, he frowned, not understanding, until she mimed pouring and sipping. He chuckled quietly. Tea, huh? Gonna have to find you some. They began working the ranch together. She didn't need instruction. She watched and learned fast. When he repaired a fence, she held the board steady. When he fed the horses, she patted their necks, whispering something in Chinese that made them calm. Sometimes he caught her humming that same tune from the first night, and for reasons he couldn't explain, the loneliness didn't sting as hard when she did. Whispers in town. One afternoon, he rode to town with her sitting behind him on the horse. The townsfolk stared. Whispers followed them like shadows. A Chinawoman? Boone's lost his mind. She can't even speak English. Elias ignored them, jaw tight. He bought supplies, tea leaves, and new curtains for her room. When they got back to the ranch, she waited until he wasn't looking, then carefully hung the curtains herself, humming softly. That night, when he sat on the porch with his pipe, she stepped outside holding 2 cups, one with coffee, one with tea. She handed him his, then sat beside him. No words, just wind and silence, and 2 warm cups between them. He watched the stars, then glanced at her. For a moment, the loneliness that had been his only companion for years felt like it had finally packed its bags and left. The first connection. A few nights later, he found her in the barn, trying to feed the mare. The bucket was too heavy. She almost dropped it. He rushed over, steadying it, his hands brushing hers. She looked up, startled. Then she laughed, light, genuine, like music. He couldn't help but smile. For the first time, the silence between them didn't feel empty. That night, he opened his journal again. She don't speak my tongue, but she looks at me like she hears everything I ain't saying. He paused, stared at the ink soaking into the page, and whispered into the quiet room. Maybe that's all I ever needed. Outside, the wind carried her humming again, faint but steady. And for the first time in 10 years, Elias Boone slept easy. The summer sun rose over Boone Ranch, turning the fields gold and the air heavy with warmth. Elias woke to the sound of clattering dishes and the smell of something sweet. In the kitchen, Lee stood barefoot, hair loose around her shoulders, stirring batter in a wooden bowl. She'd found his old cookbook and somehow, with no English, managed to make pancakes. She smiled when she saw him, gesturing to sit. He sat, half-dazed, half-amused, watching her flip the cakes with careful precision. When she placed one on his plate, she whispered, "Eat." He grinned, nodded, and took a bite. Too much salt. Way too much. He coughed, trying not to laugh. She looked horrified, covering her mouth, then suddenly burst out laughing too, a light, musical laugh that filled the empty house. He laughed with her until tears came. It was the first real laughter that had touched those walls in years. A bridge of gestures. Days passed, and the two built a rhythm without words. When he wanted her to stay back from the horses, he raised his hand. She'd nod, eyes serious. When she wanted to show him supper was ready, she'd light the lamp by the window, a signal that drew him home like a moth to warmth. He started teaching her small English words, water, horse, food. She repeated each softly, mouth careful on every sound. One afternoon, when the sun burned low, she pointed to her heart and said, "Home." He froze. That wasn't one of the words he'd taught her, but she said it with such certainty that he didn't correct her. Maybe she was right. Whispers of the town. Their quiet peace didn't go unnoticed. When Elias went into town again, he could feel the stares more than ever. Old women shook their heads. Men at the saloon muttered into their whiskey. One of them, a wiry ranch hand named Tucker, spat near his boots. "You letting her stay out there like a wife? She ain't one of us." Elias's jaw clenched. He didn't look up from the counter. "She works harder than you ever will, Tucker, and she ain't hurt nobody." The saloon went quiet. Then the bartender chuckled nervously, breaking the tension. Elias paid for his supplies and left. He didn't care for their talk, not anymore. But as he rode home, he couldn't shake the thought, will they may ever feel safe here? The word "thank you" When he returned, he found her in the field, kneeling by the flowers that grew wild near the fence line. She was humming again, that same melody from the night she arrived. He dismounted quietly, watching her. The setting sun painted her face in soft gold. For a moment, she looked like she belonged there, as much a part of the land as the sky itself. When she saw him, she stood, holding something in her hands, a small wildflower crown she'd made. She placed it on his hat and said softly, "Thank you." He blinked, surprised. You know that one?" She smiled shyly. "Yes, thank you." Then she pointed to him, then to her heart. He didn't need translation. A storm over the prairie. That night, thunder rumbled far off, low and mean. By midnight, it broke loose. Rain hammered the roof. Wind howled through the shutters. The horses spooked in the barn. Elias jumped up, throwing on his coat. But before he reached the door, Limei was already outside, barefoot, soaked, running through the mud with a lantern in her hand. He shouted, "Limei!" But the storm drowned his voice. By the time he caught up, she was standing in front of the panicked horses, whispering to them in Chinese, voice calm and steady. The mare stilled first, then the others. Elias stood there, rain dripping from his hat, breath caught in his chest. When the danger passed, he stepped closer, gently taking the lantern from her trembling hands. She looked up, soaked to the bone, eyes wide, half afraid, half proud. He reached out, brushed a strand of wet hair from her face. "Don't ever run out in a storm like that again," he murmured, though he knew she couldn't understand. She pressed her hand over his heart. Then she whispered, "You safe." He froze, the thunder echoing far away now. Her hand stayed there, steady, feeling his heartbeat. He covered her hand with his own. Neither moved. The storm around them faded. But inside, something had just begun. The morning after, when Elias woke the next morning, the sun was bright and gentle. Limei was already up, hanging wet clothes on the line, humming again. He watched her from the porch for a long moment. When she turned and saw him, she smiled. That small, quiet smile that said everything words couldn't. He walked over, held up his hand to stop her work. Then, hesitating only a second, he said, "Thank you." She laughed softly. "You learn my words now." He smiled back. "Guess I am." An understanding beyond words. Over the weeks that followed, they found a rhythm so perfect it didn't need sound. She'd bring him water when he worked. He'd mend her shoes when they tore. She'd leave small folded papers with drawings of a bird, a heart, a sun, and he'd keep each one in his journal. Sometimes at dusk, they'd sit together on the porch. He'd play the harmonica, slow, gentle tunes, and she'd close her eyes, swaying slightly to the sound. It was peace, pure and simple. But beneath that peace, Elias began to feel something stronger, something he'd never expected again in his life. Love, not the fiery kind from dime novels, but the quiet, steady kind that grows from shared silence and long looks. The night of the words. One evening, the sky turned a deep red. Limei brought out supper, rice and beans, a strange mix of east and west. They ate under the stars. Elias tried to say something, anything, but the words tangled in his throat. So instead, he picked up a stick and drew in the dirt. A heart. She looked at it for a long time, then drew her own, smaller, beside his. Then she smiled softly and whispered, "Love." He looked up stunned. "You know that word?" She nodded, then pointed to the sky, then to her heart, then to him. "Love," she repeated, barely a whisper. He didn't reply. Couldn't. He just reached out, took her hand gently, and let the silence say what he couldn't find the words for. And under the vast western sky, two hearts finally spoke the same language, the language of the heart. The air changed before the trouble came. Elias felt it in the wind, dry, sharp, the kind that carried bad news from far-off places. Even the horses knew. They kicked restlessly in their stalls, as if remembering something ugly. Limei sensed it too. For days she was quieter than usual, eyes always drawn toward the road that led east. She didn't say why. Maybe she couldn't. But her silence carried a weight he'd never heard before. Then, one afternoon, the dust on the horizon thickened. Not wind, not storm. Riders. The visitors. 3 men rode up slow, the kind who brought trouble with them wherever they went. Railroad men. From the look of their coats, gray dust, red bandanas, hard eyes. Elias stepped off the porch, rifle slung casual but ready. "Can I help you, boys?" The lead rider spat. "We're looking for a girl. Chinese. Came through the rail camps last winter. Belongs to the foreman." Li Mei had stepped out behind Elias, carrying a bucket of water. When she saw the men, the bucket slipped from her hands, spilling into the dirt. One of the riders grinned. "That's her. Didn't think she'd run this far." Elias's voice went low. "She don't belong to nobody." The man's grin faded. "You got no idea what she is. Rancher. She's property. We got papers." Elias tightened his grip on the rifle. "The only paper I need's the Bible that says every soul's their own." The man chuckled darkly. "You think you can hide her out here forever? The company don't like losing their investments." He leaned closer, eyes cold. "You hand her over. We'll forget we saw you." Elias looked back once. Li Mei standing there, fear shining in her eyes like glass under moonlight. Then he turned back to the men. "You best ride out while you still got daylight." The warning. They didn't draw, not yet. Just stared at him a long moment, measuring the kind of man he was. Then the leader spat again and said, "You'll regret this, Boone." They rode off slow, the sound of their horses fading into the distance. Li Mei rushed to him, speaking fast in Chinese, words he couldn't understand, but the tremor in her voice said enough. He set the rifle down and gently held her arms. "Hey, they're gone. You're safe." She shook her head, eyes full of tears. Then she pointed east, the direction they'd gone, and whispered one word he did understand. "Come back." Elias swallowed hard. "Let him." The long night. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the ridge. Li Mei sat across from him, silent, mending one of his shirts. Every few minutes, she looked up, as if making sure he was still there. Finally, he said quietly, "They ain't talking you. Not while I'm breathing." She didn't understand the words, but the tone, the promise in his voice, reached her. She nodded, set the shirt aside, and came to sit beside him. When she placed her head against his shoulder, something inside him settled. The kind of peace a man feels when he knows what he's willing to fight for. The return. By dawn, the riders came back. Elias heard the hoofbeats long before the dogs barked. He stepped outside, rifle in hand, the morning light painting him in gold and shadow. Li Mei stood by the doorway, clutching her wooden box. The leader dismounted, sneering. "Told you we'd be back." He nodded to the others. "Grab her." They moved to the porch. Elias raised the rifle. "That's far enough." The first man laughed. "You ain't fast enough for 3 of us." Elias didn't answer. He didn't have to. The rifle spoke for him, a crack of thunder across the valley. The first man fell. The others froze. Gunfire erupted, shattering the calm morning. Bullets tore through the fence posts, splintering wood and echoing off the barn. Li Mei screamed once, dropping to the floor inside. Elias moved like a man possessed, loading, firing, ducking behind the well. A bullet grazed his arm, another tore his sleeve. But he didn't stop. When the smoke cleared, 2 horses bolted away. One rider lay still in the dirt. Another limped off, clutching his shoulder. Only one man remained. The leader, wounded but standing, pistol shaking in his hand. He glared at Elias. "She ain't worth dying for." Elias's voice came rough. "She's worth living for." The last shot echoed. And then silence. Aftermath. Elias staggered back toward the porch, blood soaking his sleeve. Li Mei rushed to him, crying softly, guiding him inside. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it against the wound, hands trembling. He winced but managed a faint smile. "Ain't too bad." She shook her head, tears falling. Then she did something he didn't expect. She took his hand and traced letters on his palm with her finger. T-H-A-N-K-Y-O-U. He felt every letter like a heartbeat. He caught her hand gently. "You don't have to thank me, May." She looked up through tears and whispered, broken but clear, "You saved me." He smiled, weak but proud. No, darling. You saved me first. The healing days. The next few days passed slow. Elias's wound healed, though his arms stayed stiff. Limei stayed close, tending to him with quiet care, washing the blood from his shirt, cooking broth, humming those same soft songs. Sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night to find her sitting by the window, watching the stars. He asked once, "You think they'll come back?" She turned and said the one English word she'd learned best. "No." Then she pointed to the horizon, where dawn was just beginning to bloom, and smiled. The mark of peace. When the fields turned green again, Elias rode out to mend the fence the gunfire had shattered. Limei followed, helping him carry new boards. As they worked, she paused and drew something in the dirt with a stick, a small heart, and beside it, 3 marks. He frowned. "What's that mean?" She looked up and said softly, "Pass on." Then she brushed her hand across the marks, erasing them, leaving only the heart. Elias felt something rise in his throat, pride, gratitude, maybe love. He dropped to one knee, touched her shoulder, and said quietly, "Then it's just us now." She didn't understand all the words, but she smiled anyway, because some things don't need translation. The night they danced. That evening, a warm wind blew through the valley. Elias lit the lanterns, pulled the table to the porch, and opened the small music box she kept in her wooden chest. The soft, tinny melody drifted into the night. He held out his hand awkwardly. "Dance?" She tilted her head, confused. He gestured again, stepping closer. She laughed quietly, then placed her hand in his. They moved slowly, clumsily at first, the rough rancher and the gentle stranger. But after a moment, it didn't matter who led or followed. The world fell away, leaving only the sound of their hearts keeping time. When the song ended, she rested her head on his chest and whispered one word, the one she'd fought to learn. "Safe." He closed his eyes and held her close. The days turned soft again. The storms were gone, the fences stood straight, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, Elias Boone's ranch felt alive. Not because of the cattle or the grass coming green, but because of her laughter drifting through the house like wind chimes. The morning peace. Elias woke to the smell of rice and coffee mingling in the air. Limei stood at the stove, sunlight painting her hair gold. She turned, smiled, and held out a small plate. "Eat," she said, careful and proud. He grinned. "You're getting better at bossing me around." She laughed, shaking her head, not knowing all the words but catching the humor. When he took a bite, she watched like a child waiting for approval. "Perfect," he said. Her smile deepened, quiet victory in her eyes. After breakfast, they walked the fields together. She pointed at things, asking their names in broken English. "Sky, cloud, heart," he told her, slow and patient. Then she touched his chest and whispered, "Heart." He nodded. "Yeah, heart." She smiled. "Mine." Building a life. As spring ripened into summer, they built new habits the way other folks built fences. She planted a garden behind the barn, rows of strange green shoots from seeds she'd carried halfway across the world. He built her a little shed beside it, calling it Lee May's Corner. It didn't talk much. They didn't need to. A glance meant dinner. A smile meant safety. A touch on the shoulder meant I'm here. Sometimes, after long days, they'd sit on the porch. He'd play his harmonica. She'd hum along. The notes met somewhere between them, forming a language neither had to learn. The proposal without words. One golden evening, Elias disappeared into the barn for hours. Limei waited by the window, curious. When he came out, his hands were dusty, his eyes shy. He walked up to her, knelt down, and opened his palm. Inside was a small ring, carved from bone and smoothed by his knife. She gasped softly. He didn't say, "Marry me." He didn't have to. She covered her mouth, tears rising fast, then nodded again and again. He slipped the ring onto her finger. She whispered something in Chinese, words he didn't understand, but her tone, her trembling voice, made his chest ache. He smiled and said quietly, "Yeah, me too." The letter that never left. Weeks later, he sat at the same table where he'd once written to a stranger in hopes of finding a wife. Now, he wrote again, but this time not to ask for something. Just to remember, to whoever finds this letter someday. I sent for a wife once. Instead, I was sent a woman who didn't speak a word I knew. But she taught me more about talking than any preacher ever could. She taught me that love don't always come from what's said. Sometimes it comes from what's kept quiet. He folded the letter and tucked it in his journal beside her first drawing, the one with a sun and two hearts side by side. A stranger's question. Late that summer, a traveler passed through, one of those drifters looking for water and a night's shelter. Elias offered him food, and Li Mei poured tea with her quiet grace. The traveler watched them, curious. "She don't talk much, does she?" he asked. Elias looked at Li Mei, who was smiling softly at the stranger's awkward attempt to thank her in broken Chinese. He chuckled. "No, but she don't have to." The man frowned. "How do you two get along then?" Elias leaned back, eyes gentle. "Son, when you've spent half your life listening to the wind, you learn words ain't what makes things true." The quiet promise. That night, as the sun melted behind the hills, Elias and Li Mei stood at the fence line, watching the sky burn orange. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her waist. For a long time, they said nothing. The only sound was the wind whispering through the grass, carrying the faint hum of her song, the one he'd heard the first night she came. He kissed the top of her head and murmured, "Reckon you taught me something, May." She looked up, eyes warm and shining. "What?" He smiled. That sometimes the heart don't need translation. She didn't know all the words, but she understood. She placed her hand over his heart, just as she had the night of the storm, and whispered the single word she'd made her own. "Love." The wind carried it away, across the open land, over the ranch, over the endless prairie. A small word barely spoken, but strong enough to last forever.